children. And there's another practical aspect there too, just from our standpoint, in that children sometimes, particularly young female victims, tend to be a little bit more open or comfortable with a woman asking them very personal questions than they are with a male prosecutor asking the very same questions. But I think it's that nurturing side of a woman that makes her a little bit more predisposed to want to do that kind of work with children. With respect to family violence, I think that it's because some of the female prosecutors can identify with those victims a little bit more readily than the males can. They feel a calling toward that kind of work because perhaps they've known someone, they've had a friend or a family member who's been the victim of violence in their home, and so they just have a greater desire to practice that part of the law too.
Would you please share with us some cases you've prosecuted that featured a woman as the offender?
Sure. For the last 15 years, I've primarily dealt with capital murder cases, so I'll talk about a couple of cases that I've dealt with where women were the offenders. The first case was about 12 years ago, and it dealt with an offender by the name of Darlie Routier, who was a housewife and a mother in a Dallas suburb. And she had 3 children, actually. She had 2 boys, ages 6 and 4. She also had a baby under 1 year of age, and she was married. And in June of 1996, Darlie Routier, while she was in her home late at night, stabbed her 2 older boys. Their names were Darren and Devin. And what we found during the course of that investigation, when we got called in by the police, they really didn't have a primary suspect at that time, but Ms. Routier had alleged that an unknown intruder had come into her home that night and had stabbed and murdered her 2 children, and had also attempted to stab her while she was sleeping on the couch. And so when I went out there and looked at it, I was trying to make sense of the crime scene, and quite frankly, the crime scene didn't support that story almost from the beginning. And so we began looking at others as possible suspects, including the father, who was in the home at the time of the murders. And what we finally determined was this, that Darlie Routier actually stabbed her 2 children that night and then made up the story about the intruder. And the way she did it was this. She took a bread knife from inside of her home, and she cut the screen to a window leading into her garage. She then replaced the bread knife into the holder in her kitchen, and she then took a butcher knife from inside of her home, and as both the boys are sleeping on the carpet right down where she supposedly had been sleeping on the couch, she then stabbed the older boy right through the heart and stabbed him once more in the chest. And the evidence was pretty strong that the older boy never had a chance, that he never moved. His eyes were closed when we found him. The younger child, she stabbed him multiple times in the back with a knife. He actually was able to move after the initial stab wounds were inflicted. She stabbed him again as he was trying to get upstairs to his father. Then Ms. Routier then placed the murder weapon on the counter in the kitchen, and then she picked up the telephone and called 911 and began her story about the intruder coming in. But interestingly enough, one of the things that was disturbing from the beginning was that even in the midst of her 911 call, she's talking about possible fingerprints and possible forensic evidence that she might be able to preserve out there at the crime scene, and that just didn't mesh with human experience, that she'd be worrying about that instead of worrying about her 2 children. The evidence that really sealed her fate was this. We found on the bread knife in the kitchen actual material that came from the window screen that she had cut to actually simulate a break-in to her home. And then all the blood inside the home, none of it was unidentified. It all belonged to either her or her 2 children. and then blood spatter on her own nightshirt indicated that she had been the one who had actually stabbed him to death. Now, that was tried back in 1997. She received the death penalty. She's still on death row in Texas. People ask, why did she do it? I've always thought she's just a very selfish individual who was tired of the obligations or responsibilities of being a mother and wanted a freer lifestyle. Second case was a female by the name of Kimberly McCarthy. And Kimberly McCarthy was a licensed nurse who was arrested initially for stabbing to death a neighbor early one morning. She had apparently called the neighbor, asked for some sugar. She had gone over to the neighbor's home. The neighbor was an elderly woman, retired college professor. The neighbor opened the door. Kimberly McCarthy began stabbing her. She then proceeded to place the neighbor's finger onto a chopping block and actually chopped off the neighbor's ring finger so that she could get the neighbor's wedding band and wedding ring. The neighbor died. Miss McCarthy then took the property, the ring, and other property from the neighbor's home, went to a drug house in Dallas, sold it off, and obtained money for those items. Initially, we looked at that case to determine whether we'd seek the death penalty. The initial reaction was probably not, but then as we started to look at cold case material and DNA material, it became clear that Ms. McCarthy had committed two previous cases about 10 years before that, both involving elderly women, both cases where Ms. McCarthy had taken a knife and had stabbed two elderly women to death. And so based on the fact that we now had Ms. McCarthy killing not one but three women, we proceeded to try Ms. McCarthy for the death penalty as well, obtained the death penalty on her, and she is also down in death row at this time. And just to gain some perspective, I believe at this time there are 9 or 10 women total on Texas death row.
Do you prepare for these cases differently than you do for those with male offenders?
Yeah, I do. And I'll tell you why. Because I know from experience in talking to literally hundreds of jurors on these types of cases individually, because in Texas when we do a death penalty case, we talk with the jurors individually, and so I've had an opportunity to really gain some insight into how jurors view these types of offenders. And it's just human nature, I suppose, but jurors tend to look a bit more suspiciously at cases like this because it's hard for them to believe that a woman would commit such a violent, horrible crime of capital murder. And so you have to combat that a little bit. And then secondly, I think, again, it's just human nature perhaps, but I think the jurors tend to be, as a whole anyway, tend to be a little bit more skeptical about imposing a death penalty against a woman than they would be a man. And so the preparation, is really in the jury selection. And we try to really tailor our questions to get at the primary issue, and that is, are you going to treat this person more leniently or differently? Are you going to look at our evidence differently, or are you going to hold us to a higher standard simply because we're trying a woman instead of a man for capital murder? So most of the preparation and most of the different effort really goes into jury selection, which in many cases can last between 3 and 5 weeks on capital cases.
Could you please tell us how Texas defines capital murder?
Now, capital murder in Texas is set by statute, and it's always an intentional murder plus something else. And our aggravating factors are either it's committed during the course of another felony, such as a robbery, kidnapping, burglary, the intentional death of a child younger than 6 years of age, of course, the intentional murder of a police officer or firefighter while they're in the course of the duties. And we have a number of other categories, but in Texas, like in, I believe, every other state, it's always an intentional murder plus some statutorily defined aggravating circumstance.
In your opinion, do you think that women are as violent, equally violent, or less violent than men?